Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for part 2 of a 4-part series as we play Inside a Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. So let's jump right into things. We open with Nora lamenting Krogstad's threats. Krogstad, hard to say. The nurse, who we also learn was Nora's nurse while Nora was growing up, and the nurse in that way had sacrificed time with her own daughter, raising and rearing her own daughter. She brings in Nora's fancy Christmas dress, which is ripped, but that's okay, because up shows Mrs. Lynde, who has come after Nora called on her to help mend the dress. While working, Mrs. Lynde surmises that the rich benefactor who had helped Nora in her time of need with Torvald's health had been Dr. Rank. Nora gets angry with this nonsense, and Mrs. Lynde notices that something is amiss. At this time, Torvald comes home, and Nora pleads with him again that Krogstad should keep his post. And Torvald says it can't be done, as that is the post to be held by Mrs. Lynde. She got Torvald to fire Krogstad to hire Mrs. Lynde. Nora continues to beg, but Torvald tells her that he is all but fired already. He even goes so far as to say that Krogstad, he wouldn't be above letting Krogstad keep his position for his work ethic, despite the fact that he has questionable morals. But the little prick Krogstad is just too chummy, as the two knew each other from boyhood. So that is what is really sticking in old Torvald's craw. Nora, she just won't stop, and Torvald gets angry with her and sends the maid out with Krogstad's letter of dismissal immediately. And Nora hits the roof. They fight, and to conclude the fight, Torvald gets all lovey-dovey before retreating to his office. And he tells her to send Rank right in when he gets there. He is expecting Dr. Rank. However, Dr. Rank shows up, and Nora refuses to send Dr. Rank straight to the office. She says instead that Torvald is busy, and she uses this time to make her move on Dr. Rank, thinking that he might be able to help her in her time of desperation now, after being angry at Mrs. Lynde for assuming that was the case before. So she makes her move, and she shows Dr. Rank her stockings. And at this point, Dr. Rank assumes more is going on than that which Nora might be comfortable with, and he confesses to her his love. Nora, I suppose doing the only thing that makes sense to her at that moment, becomes irate with him, because he was, I guess, playing too well into her hands. It's hard to say. So she goes ahead and she sends him in to see Torvald. Enter the Krog. Krogstad has come, and he has the calm of a mob boss. And during her time of distress, Krogstad warns her against doing anything irrational. He even mentions suicide, and he knows that she has already thought of that, because when he was in his dark place, he had thought of it too. So he warns against that, and he means to blackmail Torvald, not just into keeping his post at this point, but into rehabilitating his entire image. And at that point, he will be pulling the strings of the bank from behind the scenes. And Nora says how unlikely this is, and she sends him away. On his way out, he drops this blackmail letter in the mailbox for Torvald. She does not have a key to the mailbox. This is how Mrs. Lynde learns that it was in fact Krogstad who had lent her the money all those years ago. And she says she will go to him because there was a time he'd have done anything for her. Apparently old Krogstad was quite in love with Mrs. Lynde at one point. So she leaves to find him, and as Rank and Torvald emerge from the office, Nora tries to distract Torvald because she knows he's about to check that mailbox. So she pulls the old 1-2, you've got to teach me how to dance, you've got to teach me how to play the tambourine, you've got to train me up for this party that we're going to tonight. This was your idea, don't you remember? And he distracts her, she distracts him for a while, long enough for Mrs. Lynde to return and tell her that she could not find Krogstad. Krogstad had already left the town. Nora says she knew that from the way Mrs. Lynde was acting. So there's a few things I think that are worth talking about here. And all of them really come from the same sort of theme. I'm coming to this text straight off the heels of Peer Gynt, which was Henrik Ibsen's first play, this being his second full-length play. And one thing that is seeming to pop up time and time and time again with Ibsen's work is the idea of inheriting things from our parents, the idea of things being hereditary, the idea that there is no break between childhood and adult. We are the same thing, just a little older. So just in the same way that there is no such thing as the missing link, because every time you find the missing link between my neighbor is watching television at the loudest possible setting here at 4 o'clock in the morning. But anytime you find some intermediary point in evolution, you've created a missing link on either side of that, because no one thing is going to lead directly into any other skeleton that you had found. In much the same way, we never become adult, because if you wanted to look at any point in our own lives, there would never be adult on one side of that stage in life and child on the other. That seems to be part of what is being communicated to me. And the first thing that I'd like to talk about in this is one of the first things that we mentioned in that rundown. Nora does not sew. Nora does not know how to mend a dress. Nora does not know any of these cloth-making skills. This tells us a lot about Nora. Much in the same way that the nurse on hand is the same nurse that had raised Nora, Nora is living in a condition now that she lived in as a child. She is wealthy. She was not taught to mend dresses. She was not taught clothes making. And this tells us, so we are shown many times in this text already that in the society that this takes place, men are the breadwinners. They are the only ones that can go out and have a family-supporting job. Women like Mrs. Lynde are forced into labor because she has lost a husband and had children at home to take care of. Had to fend for herself, as it were. So it is notable that Nora does not know these dressmaking skills, these mending skills, because that would have been a vital tool for a person that was not of uber wealthy status to have. So during this time, Torvald, Nora, Mrs. Lynde, old Krogstad himself, none of them are walking out of this mansion taking a left, swinging a right at the post office, and ending up at a Walmart. So the clothes were more expensive, they were more scarce, or they were in lesser supply, I suppose would be the better way to say that. So when you had clothing, you had to be able to mend it if you intended on wearing it through. So I work retail, and I go through a pair of pants every month and a half, 2 months. I just wear through them. So at this time, when things were so much more, I can just run to Walmart, spend $12.88 on a pair of khakis, and replace my work pants. That was not the case during this time. So for a woman to be in full-fledged adulthood and not have these skills means that it was never the case that she was going to have to use them. That she was always going to be able to employ someone to do those things. There was never a fail-safe on that. Which leads me to page 35. This quote, which is during Nora's and Torvald's argument about Krogstad. Torvald says this, "And I hear he's a good worker too, but I knew him when we were boys. It was one of those rash friendships that so often prove an incubus in afterlife. I may as well tell you plainly, we were on very intimate terms with one another, but this tactless fellow lays no restraint on himself when other people are present. On the contrary, he thinks it gives him the right to adopt a familiar tone with me, and every minute it is, 'I say, Helmer, old fellow,' and that sort of thing. I assure you it is extremely painful for me. He would make my position in the bank intolerable." This is one of those quotes where Torvald is expressing the fact that he did not like Krogstad as a child, and he does not like Krogstad as an adult for the very same reasons. Basically meaning that we do not change as we age. There is no clear dichotomy between childhood and adulthood, and those things that shape us now have always shaped us. We were melded from that clay at an early age, and we do make those same mistakes now, and we will forever forth. It's sort of like, I think the statement from Ibsen is sort of like, less like, I'm stuttering now because I'm trying to think how to frame it. We accept childhood as a state of life. We accept adolescence as a stage of life. We accept young adulthood as a stage of life. We accept adulthood as a stage of life, and we accept old age as a stage of life. If you look at a tree, where do you draw the line between sapling and tree? Have you ever used the word sapling in your life? Or is it just a tree? You just point at it, and that's a little tree compared to the big trees, but it's still a tree. I think part of the statement here is when we are younger, we're not children, we're little people, but we're still people. Many of the things that go into that little person are going to be what shapes the bigger person. Which is interesting. It sort of reminds me of one of the big objections with the third wave feminism are gender pronouns, and how if you were to describe someone, one of the first things you would say to distinguish, if someone came into my place of work and stole a bottle of liquor, one of the first things out of my mouth would probably be the person's gender. It was a man. It was a woman. Why is that key note there? The key note that I must put first. Why is that the identifier with which I call forth first? Which is an interesting question. Interesting enough. So I think part of the claim here is, why do we give children so much grace, and why don't we extend any of that grace to adults? We are very quick to write off mistakes by children. We don't give adults that same leeway for stupidity. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's the opposite, and it's saying that we do judge adults harshly, and we should know that we should judge children more harshly, because allowing that pot to boil and boil over with bad intent and terrible actions is what causes an adult to be a bad person with terrible intents. Either way, I think it is interesting because there is that projection in that statement that Krogstad was as he is as an adult, as a child. We also get the opposite. On page 32, Mrs. Lynde, in speaking to Nora, says, "Listen to me, Nora. You are still very like a child in many things, and I am older than you in many ways, and have a little more experience. Let me tell you this, you ought to make an end of it with Dr. Rank." As if Nora doesn't understand what can go wrong there. There is here this infantilization of Nora. And part of that infantilization of Nora stems from the fact that, like we said earlier, she doesn't have adult wares. She does not have skills that an adult has. She is allowed to remain sort of ignorant, sort of stupid. Not that she is. She seems to be very cunning. She seems to be very able. But she is not forced to be. And because she is not forced to be, those around her, Mrs. Lynde, who have been forced to take care of themselves, or like Torvald, who is taking care of a family, they look on her as if she were still very, very childlike. And she, in their defense, she does this part of this by playing it up. She does give Torvald cutesy faces and act very ditzy when he's around. She wants him to remain thinking of her in that way, it seems. And it seems Torvald is very married, not just to her, but the idea of thinking of her as much younger, as sort of sprightly. It's weird to see this relationship in today's world, especially as women are in the workforce as well, and an adult relationship between a man and a woman is a relationship of equals, because both has to go to work, both have equal responsibilities at home, both have equal responsibilities financially, and all of these different things, where it was not the way during the time when the story was written. So it is an interesting sort of thing to look at and try to understand rather than to judge. Personally, I could not stand Nora. I would not be able to stand being around someone like that. Because you want to use the word trigger, it would trigger me to be around someone who is trying very hard to grasp at this idea of irresponsibility. She wants to only accept responsibility, it seems, when it's absolutely necessary, and when she thinks she can get away with something. And in fact, she seems to really relish in the act of getting away with something. It seems to be the only time where she's alive, as if she's sort of pulling the rug out from under this condescension that she gets from all of the adults in her life. She enjoys the power that she has over them because they look at her in that way, when she is so much more cunning than that would seem to allow. And certainly more cunning than that would necessitate. And leading into this, on page 31, we get this exchange from Mrs. Lynde. Is Dr. Rank always as depressed as he was yesterday? And Nora says, no. Yesterday it was very noticeable. I must tell you that he suffers from a dangerous disease. He has consumption of the spine, poor creature. His father was a horrible man who committed all sorts of excesses, and that is why his son was sickly from childhood. Do you understand? Again, this idea of our parents shaping us as children and our childhood deciding our future. But it goes a little bit deeper than that on page 38, because I think it's difficult to catch the implication in that first quote. He's sickly because of the way his father was. That could be justified, that could be understood, that could be rationalized. You could understand that as he was abused as a kid, as he was malnourished as a child, so they didn't used to know all that we know today about everything in vitro and how in utero, I might be mixing up my terms there, and how all of that comes from the mother's diet. And think health during pregnancy comes from the mother's diet. And they didn't know as much about diet, and they didn't know as much about that. So it was thought that there could be some impact on the child through the spermatic transfer, or through, I don't know how to say it. Okay, it's weird to talk about, but that's sort of something that they thought. So it could be, that former quote could be written off as that. But on page 38, Dr. Rank is talking about his own disease and the fact that he thinks he is about to die. And he says that Nora says she expected him to be in good humor, and Rank says, with death stalking beside me, to have to pay this penalty for another man's sin? Is there any justice in that? And in every family, in one way or another, some such inexorable retribution is being exacted. Which brings us to two sort of things. Number one, our main thrust here, that we are shaped as children by our parents. Not only that, but we have to pay for their sins. And sometimes we have to pay for the sins of our fathers up until our death. Till our final days, we are paying off the sins of our fathers. This idea of inherited sin is very religious. It is something that I think, I have never heard of it prior to. I have never heard of it prior to the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's possible that it was there and I don't know about it. I do know that there were presumed to be simply evil families. But this idea that the child should suffer for the sins of the father, I've never heard of that prior to Judeo-Christian values. And this comes to us. So first off, just to finish that idea with our main thrust here, about this being to do with lineage, really. A lot of the Ibsen stories are going towards that route with lineage and what we inherit from previous generations. I think that in addition to that, our last story that we read, Per Gynt, was not exactly in the Christian tradition either. So here, Dr. Rank, who seems to be maybe not the most forthright character that we have so far, in that he was willing to confess his love to his best friend's wife. But certainly someone who seems to be willing to stand up for what it is that he believes is right. He seems to be, to some extent, a respectable and values-driven character. To some extent. To some extent above many of the other characters in this play so far. And here he is questioning this idea that he should pay for the sins of his father, saying very clearly, is there any justice in that? Is there any justice in that idea from the Almighty Judge? Is there any justice in the cyclical nature of suffering through family, in that idea given to us, inundated in us, and forced into our lives by that Almighty Judge? It's a hell of a question for someone to be asking, especially in a very Christian time, a time in what one might call prime Christendom. So that is all that I have for this Act 2 of A Doll's House. I hope to see you back next week for Act 3, and then finally, the review the next week for A Doll's House. If you like this sort of thing, hit that like button because it really helps me out on the channel. If you really want to help me out on the channel, you are always welcome to share this video on some form of social media with someone who likes literature or plays or Henrik Ibsen, or maybe just your cousin, or maybe your sick father from whom you will inherit sin.